So I welcome all of you back for the second session of the Research Scholars Conference. The second session's theme is Celebration of Life, Challenges of Death, and the Questions of Ethics. The chair for this panel would be Professor Vijay Lakshmi Singh, and each panelist will get 20 minutes to present their paper. And after all the papers have been presented, we'll have a 40-minute slot for question answers. The chair will remind all the panelists around 15 minutes that they should start summing their papers up. I now hand over the mic to Professor V.L. Singh.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I thought I'm late, so I intervened. There are 4 papers right now in this session. The first one is प्राचीन भारतीय ग्रंथों में बाल्यकाल से संबंधित अनुष्ठान एवं संस्कार. This is it talks about the ancient period, and Asha Rani is the scholar who will speak on this. I don't know whether she is present or not. Let's see how it goes.
I think she was trying to join Vijaya, and she's not able to join. I just talked to her on the phone. So she was trying to join. That's what I.
Okay, so we can start with another paper, no?
Yeah.
Ratna Priya is present here. Ratna Priya is also not present right now. So Ratna, you are there?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. So we can start with you, the terror of death, understanding untimely demise of the in the Puranas, because there's the time slot is limited. So let's start first, and discussion will take place later on. Okay, Ratna, you can start with.
Okay, ma'am. Good morning, everyone, respected chair and my fellow colleagues. My paper today will talk about the issue of untimely death as represented in the Puran, with a specific focus on the Garud Puran. In my work, I would be discussing the rituals revolving around such deaths and will also try to draw your attention to certain socio-cultural aspects in such conditions. As the text goes, I have examined the funeral rituals represented by the Venkateshwara version of the Garud Puran. The part of the text which is generally regarded as authoritative on funeral rites is the Uttarakhand section of it, which is popularly known as the Pret Kalp or the Pret Khand. This part contains material on karma, rebirth, the path to Yama, the fate of Pretas, ghosts, and the torments of hell, interspersed with instructions about rites for the dying person, the corpse, and the ghost. As Hazra has argued that this whole section is a later addition to the Garud Puran, since it has a fresh beginning and the subjects dealt are not mentioned in the summary of contents in the main body of the Garud Puran. It is difficult to establish the date at which this material became the part of Garud Puran, since this is dependent on establishing a date for the main body of the text, which as it opinions to be somewhere around from 6th century to 10th century or 11th century CE. In contrast to timely death, Akal Mrityu is one for which the deceased cannot be said to have prepared herself or himself. The victim here gets forced to relinquish life prematurely, which creates a sense of terror in the minds of living, specifically the ones responsible to carry out the last rites of such victims. We call a death untimely when someone has intent to live, but suddenly something strikes them down and they die. If a yogi or an ascetic decides to leave his body consciously at any age, we don't say it as untimely. It is timely for them irrespective of the age and the physical condition because they decide the time. As mentioned in the Garud Puran, it is the Kala, sometimes personified as Yam, which detaches the soul from the body and causes the death of the person at the appointed hour without a single exception. Once the time of the death approaches, then by chance a certain disease raises up and the organs grow weaker and the soul leaves the body. This is the moment when the body becomes untouchable and despicable. It is after then that the death rituals proceed for the deceased. However, in cases of untimely deaths, we see how the attitude towards the dead changes drastically, and the terror that surrounds the living after such deaths lead them to follow different rituals than in case of natural deaths. I would like to describe a few cases here with respect to untimely deaths, and will also try to showcase how death provokes an ambivalent reaction in the Brahmanic funerary rites. The ambivalence is clearly displayed in rituals where the corpse is treated both as pure and impure, and the spirit of the deceased as both as dangerous ghost and a godlike ancestor. Here, in cases of untimely deaths, the fear of the ghost is relatively more marked than the natural ones. As stated in the Garud Puran, a person can meet with untimely death irrespective of his age, caste, and class. He could be an ascetic or yogi, intelligent, pious, and all-knowing Brahmin, or even a mighty king. Unlike the Vedic texts, which ascribes a man to live 100 years, the Puranas state that under the influence of his or her misdeeds, the person dies an untimely death. A person not living according to the norms of the Varna hierarchy are seen as major sinners, even if he is a king. And the Puran mentions different rituals in case of several untimely deaths. I would first like to focus on the death about child or children. In cases of miscarriage or abortion, the impurity is for as many days as the number of months of conception. If a child dies after birth, but before the tonsure ceremony, the dead body is merely buried and milk is distributed among the children of the neighborhood in order to please them. Older children are generally cremated. There's a lack of rites at child funerals, whereas at an adult's death, the relatives have to process the ghost, which results from the deceased's lifetime of accumulated karma before he can achieve rebirth. The death of a person over 5 years, all 10 pindas are offered along with milk puddings and sugar. The gift of the bed and release of bull is also mentioned in this case, but the rite of Sapindikarnam is not necessary. What is important here that the Garud Puran mentions rituals of ascending complexity in case of child deaths. In case of infants, which are termed as Shishu, milk is distributed through the medium of other children. Young children called Bala, milk, food, and clothes are distributed. The older children, who are termed as Poganda, here food through gifts to children and Brahmin are distributed and also given pindas. The youth or the Kishora, here we see food through gifts to children, Brahmins are distributed with pindas, and also gifts of bed, cow, land, and bull release are performed. It is possible that the more complex rituals reflect the idea that older children have rudimentary ghosts which are not as dangerous as those of adults and require less processing. Interestingly, the untimely death of an unmarried youth is not much feared in the text, which is surprising as it could be more dangerous with unfulfilled wishes and might lead the corpse into perpetual ghosthood. When a man dies without a son, he suffers the same fate as the sinful and cannot hope to gain salvation. According to the story of King Bhabruvahana in the Garud Puran, a man who dies without progeny, relatives, or friends to perform his funeral rites, for him, he is doomed to perpetual ghosthood. Such ghosts torments, causes diseases, barrenness, financial misfortune, and family quarrels. The Garud Puran mentions that such fate can be avoided if a person carries his own obsequial rites while alive, which is called Jivat Shraddha or Shraddh for the living. Here, he cremates Kushagra's figure and makes a series of libations and offers rice balls along with aragya, and he also holds his own Sapindakarna. Also, in case this entire process actually goes on for a month, but there is an other alternative where he has to perform the funeral rite named Narayan Bali, where an effigy of the person is cremated with the release of the bull. In the story of King Bhabru Vahana, the monarch frees a ghost who has no son, friends, or relatives to perform his funeral by performing Narayan Bali. But at other instances in the text, lack of a son is seen as evidence of former misdeeds, and hence, as in common with other types of unnatural adult death, which are also result of sinful lives, the sonless man can only be rescued from ghosthood by the performance of Narayan Bali and the bull release. The text, however, does not mention if the Jivat Shraddh has been performed, still Narayan Bali is required from becoming a perpetual ghost. Also, for a sonless, only Ekadasha Shraddh is performed when normally Parvan Shraddh is performed, which suggests that the sonless cannot have the Parvan Shraddh, which is mainly prescribed as the ideal memorial rite. In cases of women dying in childbirth or during pregnancy, so a woman dying during menses are termed as Rajaswala, or women dying immediately after childbirth are termed as Sutika. Such women are basically purified first and then cremated. So she's bathed with water, purified by reciting Punya mantras, and cooled by 100 winnowing fans. She is also bathed with Panchagavya, and her clothes are changed with fresh ones before she is cremated as prescribed. No further rites are mentioned in her case. Now, it is interesting that women who die during menstruation or childbirth are not included in the list of unnatural deaths or accidental deaths for which Narayan Bali is prescribed. Since special regulations are prescribed for purification of women dying during menses or childbirth for cremation, suggests that as far as the Uttarakhand section is concerned, the Narayan Bali is not performed after such deaths. The list of accidental or unnatural deaths are exhaustive in the Puran. However, it is difficult to see why death in case of childbirth or during menstruation should not necessitate the performance of Narayan Bali. Furthermore, the King Bhabru Vahana story appears to contain a certain version of the Narayan Bali which does not include the cremation of a substitute corpse. This is surprising because the ghost of a woman dying in childbirth could equally be dangerous as the one of a sonless man whose ghosthood represents unfulfilled desires. Next, I would talk about death in case of certain diseases like leprosy, cholera, and smallpox. So people dying from such diseases were included in the list of unnatural deaths, and such people were bound to go to hell and roam around as ghosts who roam over the earth. Now, Narayan Bali is immediately prescribed in such cases. Depending on the caste hierarchy, the Brahmins were supposed to complete the rituals within a period of 6 months, the Kshatriyas within 3, Vaishyas within a month and a half, and Shudras immediately. People dying of contagious diseases are looked upon as greater sinners. The rite of Narayan Bali is performed and it contains all major features of normal funerary rites like the gift of padas, a set of Ekodisha Shraddhs, but in addition, it includes a ceremony of worship and meditation on Lord Vishnu, which is not to be seen in normal funeral ceremony. Therefore, the obsequial rites up to the end of the pollution are compressed in one ceremony based on the cremation of an effigy of the deceased. The burning of an effigy is also mentioned in the Vedic rituals where death happens abroad and the body is not available to the family. But in the Garud Puran, we find that the burning of the effigy is allowed both in cases of death happening abroad and also in cases of abnormal death where the body is still present. Although the Garud Puran gives no explanation as to why an effigy should be cremated, but it could be thought that the corpse is seen unfit for cremation. Now, the tension between pure and impure, which surrounds the corpse of a surrounds the corpse after a normal death, is not present after an unnatural death. Instead, here the body is wholly impure and inauspicious, and so cannot be offered as a pure sacrifice into fire. Interestingly, while the Garud Puran ceremonies for normal funerals have much in common with the Vedic ritual, those for an abnormal death are largely non-Vedic and aim to prevent the deceased from becoming a dangerous ghost. Therefore, belief in and fear of dangerous ghosts has increasingly influenced Orthodox ritual, which in its early Vedic form was simply concerned with offering the pure sacrifice of the corpse and processing the impure spirit so that it became an ancestor. In case of the Garud Puran, the Narayan Bali funeral rite seems to have a dual functionality. In the ritual section of the Garud Puran, Narayan Bali is seen as a funeral to process those in danger of becoming ghosts. While the king's version, it seems that it is more of an exorcistic rite dealing with those who have already become permanent ghosts. In case of death due to violence or suicides, people who commit suicide or die violently are included in the text's list of abnormal deaths, which require the performance of Narayan Bali. It is believed that such people have died as a result of their bad karma and are considered among the greatest sinners. If the family by chance does normal funerary rites for such people, it is all destroyed in the air. These souls neither go to hell or heaven, but remain on earth as a bad spirit, and they wander aimlessly till they complete their actual allotted time, and thereafter go to hell and suffer more severely. These were some of the case studies of untimely death that I've discovered. And I would like to conclude my paper by, understanding like the study of the Garud Puran and looking into the issue of untimely death. Actually, it opens significant findings about not only the ambivalence present in the rituals, but also different socio-cultural nature of them. Interestingly, the length of impurity observed by the Varnas in the case of death by accident or violence represents an inversion of the traditional order in which Brahmins observe the shortest period of primary pollution and Shudras the longest. This inversion of normal order emphasizes the abnormal nature of such deaths. We also see a gendered notion of belief in ghosts, where a sunless man is more feared as a ghost as a result of his unfulfilled wishes. But in case of a woman dying at childbirth, it's not true, since the ritual of Narayan Bali is prescribed for the sunless man and not the women. Hence, the issue of untimely death not only created variations in funerary rites, which was primarily concerned with dealing with a bad karma, but it also instigated a terror in the minds of people in terms of dangerous ghosts whose presence would create major issues in the lives of the living. Also, the importance of physical presence is a very crucial part of the ritual life, and that's especially true for funerals. The COVID pandemic highlighted this importance quite evidently. There is something about ritual and the connection between the physical body that creates something like what the French sociologist Émile Durkheim called collective effervescence. It is the sense in which people moved beyond the sense of being a bounded self to being connected. Hence, physical connection and physical presence matter to the perceived effectiveness of mourning ritual. As we saw during the pandemic, that the body is there, but we couldn't have it, and we needed it for the rituals. If understood deeply, all death rituals have something in common, and that is to carry out or realize a good death, which is to make sure that the person dead is properly sent off, whether timely or untimely. It's almost the case that we cannot leave our dead alone and need to perform certain ritual acts according to a set of pre-existing norms. When these norms are not met properly, there is a risk of the deceased not reaching the state they ought to be in, as we also understood in the case of Garud Puran, where the fear became more prominent in case of unnatural deaths. That is why a good death is important, coupled with performing the rituals in a proper way. This is not only a symbolic triumph of life over death, but also over the inevitability that we will all die, that we will
Please
never
conclude. Please conclude.
Thank you. I just finished, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. It was a nice paper. It is open for discussion with the students. Any question?
Excuse me, ma'am.
Ma'am, I think the discussion will take place at the end after all the presentations.
Acha, we have decided this. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So we can go for the next paper, which is has Asha come?
Yeah.
Asha, you can start your paper. Asha? Asha? Okay.
Masha has to unmute herself. So
I'll just
Isn't
give her
it-
a call because I think she's not very
Okay.
confident with this system. I'll just call her, Vijay.
Okay, we'll wait. Or we can switch over to next paper. She can do it at the end if she's not confident.
She may not be able to come again. I'll just get back.
Okay, you can try. Yeah.
आशा आप शुरू करो ना, आपको बुला रहे हैं आपको. आप अपना अनम्यूट करो और कैमरा ऑन करो, ठीक है?
कोई बात नहीं, हमें इनको encourage तो करना ही है ना.
Yeah, she is a little tentative. Let's hope she is
I will-
able to present. हाँ, आ गई.
Good.
आशा अपना माइक ऑन करो, आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही. I think you go to the next paper. I'll chat with her. I'll see.
Okay. Try and
Yeah.
Okay. The is Dheeraj Kumar Sahani here?
Yeah.
Dheeraj, we can do your paper now, the practical theosophy, a historical conceptual study in the historical-conceptual study in the ethical term.
Yeah.
So you can start.
Am I audible to all?
Yeah, you are audible to us.
Yeah. Okay.
You have 5 minutes.
Yeah. 5 minutes.
No, 25, 20 to 25 minutes.
Okay. So this paper is I'm going to present it like it's a practicing perspectival hermeneutics. So the perspective is coming from the COVID-19, and I'm going to dedicate this paper to all people who lended me money in the time of COVID, when I was stuck in the lockdown days, because this ethical turn is coming from there. So people were helping to each other in that period. So for this paper, it's little theoretical. So it's necessary to clear it that what is ethical turn, and it's a practice of conceptual history. Like those who have read Reinhard Koselleck can relate it. So this ethical turn is coming from the works of Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida, who talks about the face of the other and the other, humanism of the other, in critique of the decisionist theories like Carl Schmitt. So I'm going to read out this. You will get some clues. The pandemic of COVID-19 affected almost every aspect of the forms of life. The form of life is coming from Agamben, and they compelled to think again over the active categories like living, learning, imagining, and the concepts like body, life, experience, human, death, politics, etc. And the public or academic intellectuals thought about it, particularly Balibar, Jacques Nancy, Roberto Esposito, Zizek were writing from this perspective and provided a space for the practice of perspectival hermeneutics over these categories. This paper maps the ethical aspects of being human and looks ethics as the object of corrosive critique. In the time of failure, in the time of exception or emergency, ethics emerge as a concrete double reading. It's a synonyms of the deconstruction of the being in the body. It's like being in the world, or one's place in the world from other and the other. People willed to do something positive and were feeling, thinking about the care of the self and the other. People try to maintain human existence, the life of humans in the world through the bond of friendship, fellow feeling, hospitality, humanism of the other, to dwell in the world. So this paper is talking about immanence, not the transcendental category, transcendence. So I'm going to introduce what is the concept of theosophy. H.P. Blavatsky. This term was popularized by H.P. Blavatsky, who was the founder of the Theosophical Society. So the practical theosophy is linked to it. It's a broader category. The idea of practical theosophy was theorized by H.P. Blavatsky, who was the founder of the Theosophical Society in India in 1882. The practical theosophy is a single elementary aspect of the Blavatsky conception of theosophy. The conceptual content in the conception of theosophy is divine knowledge, wisdom, love, and truth. The identification of the theosophy with relation to the concepts like wisdom and knowledge, theosophy creates an authority of these concepts. This authority is talking about Alexandria Kojève, who talks about authority. Theosophy is defined with respect to philosophy. It is not philosophy, but simply includes every philosophy as every science and religion. Theosophy follows the conceptual definition of philosophy, and it is the lifeblood of that system, which is defined as the science of the things divine and human and causes which they are contained. Theosophy alone possesses the keys to those causes, bearing in mind simply its most elementary division. We find that philosophy is the love of and the search of wisdom, the knowledge of phenomena as explained by the resolved into the cause and reasons, power and laws. When applied to God and gods, it become in every theology. When to material nature, it was called physics and natural history. Concerned with man, it appeared as anthropology and psychology. And when raised to the neither realm of become as a metaphysics. So such is philosophy, the science of effect by their causes, the very spirit of doctrine of karma, the most important teaching under the various name of every religions, philosophy and the philosophical tenet that belongs to no one religion but explain them all. Theosophy follows the definite meaning of philosophy, like it is the science of the thing divine, which human and the causes in which they are contained, that is concerned with the affair of the divine and human both simultaneously. I am leaving some section because it's by time. And further, I am going to discuss about the concept of karma in theosophy, where I am seeing this concept as an ethical category. So Blavatsky analysis of the concept of karma is a thinking on causality that deals with the life cycle, conscious life, and the universal law of distributive, strict and impartial justice. It is a power which cannot fail and can therefore have neither worth nor mercy, only absolute equity, which leaves every cause, great or small, to work out its inevitable effect. And it is considered as the ultimate law of the universe, the source of origin, the fount of all laws which exist throughout the nature. Blavatsky writes, karma is not individual law, it is interdependence of humanity. That is important. What is called distributive law, and it is this law which affords the solution to the great question of the collective suffering. Like people were in corona, there was a collective suffering and its relief. It is an occult law, moreover, that no man can rise superior to his individual failings. without lifting, be it ever so little. The whole body of which is she is an integral part. For Blavatsky, in reality, there is no such thing as separatedness. And here she is providing a critique of the dichotomic thinking, like the idea of subject-object, self-other. Blavatsky, in existential conception of individual is relational. A better understanding of the existential notion of the existence of the individual with the other can be understood with the help of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's concept of being with, that is our normal social way of being. Heidegger identifies being with the design. For Heidegger, design is essentially being with, and being with is an existential characteristic of design, even when practically no other is occurred or perceived. Dreyfus clarify it as the being with is an aspect of being in the world that makes possible in counting of the particular others whose ways of being Heidegger called design with. Blavatsky defined karma as the law of readjustment, which ever tends to restore distributed equilibrium in the physical, the broken harmony in the moral world, and does not act in the particular way always, but it was always does act as the restorer of harmony and preserve the balance of equilibrium in virtue of which the universe exists. Next, I am going to think about the concept of duty, and where I am talking, seeing duty as a critique of the auto, like self-sufficiency. It's a critique of self-sufficiency. Like you can't, when you are not Atmanirbhar, you can't do something for everyone or always. So Jean-Luc Nancy in the Corona period, right, in the critique of self-sufficiency, he provides a better critique of the concept of self-sufficiency and emphasizes on the idea of interdependence. During the pandemic, Nancy writes, alongside our sense of certainty or assuredness, it will come as no surprise that our sense of sufficiency and autonomy or the self-reliance has been shaken. And this is true whether we are concerned with the self-sufficiency of the individual or the group of a state or any number of the international institutions of the scientific or moral authorities. In any event, what we have seen is a rival of the interdependence. That interdependence, which is the hallmark of the virus, as well as the solidarity. So the concept of duty in theosophy also thinks about interdependence. That is also tied with the experience of the existential togetherness and interdependence. Blavatsky writes, our philosophy teaches us that the object of doing our duties to all men and to ourselves, the last. So for Blavatsky, the other was the primary concern and the self was the secondary. Is not an attainment of personal happiness, but the happiness of the other, the fulfillment of the right for the sake of the right, not for what we may bring us. Happiness, or rather contentment, may indeed follow the performance of duty, but it is not and must not be the motive for it. In the conception of universal brotherhood, duty is constituted for the ethical awakening, as Emmanuel Levinas say, by the recognizing the face of the other, that care of the other. It is debt to the individual that is to be paid to the fellow man. For Blavatsky, duty is that which is due to humanity, to our fellow man, neighbor, family, especially that which we owe to all those who are poorer and more helpless than we are ourselves. This is a debt which, if left unpaid during life, leaves our spiritually involvement and morally bankrupt in our next incarnation. It is a full recognition of the equal rights and privilege for all, and without distinction of race, color, social position, or birth. What makes duty international in the highest sense is that its members, men, women, and all races, create forms of thought who are together for one object, the improvement of humanity. But as the society, it takes absolutely no part in any national or party politics. The conception of duty advocates for the inclusive shared existence of the being where purpose is for common interest and goal. The action of an individual affects the other one. And Blavatsky writes, if when one reacts to on the lives of the all, and this is the true scientific idea, then it is only by all becoming brothers and all women sisters, and by all participating their daily lives. True brotherhood and true sisterhood, that is the real human solidarity, which lie at the root of the elevation of the race. can ever be attained. It is this action and interaction, this true brotherhood and sisterhood in which shall we live for all and all for each. Blavatsky emphasizes on the concrete fact of the human society that is concerned with the lives not only of the masses of the people, but many of those who were called the middle and upper classes, with what they might be under healthier and nobler condition, where justice, kindness, and the love were the paramount. So for Blavatsky, there is no in itself existence for the being. It is always tied with the existence of the other, with integrity. According to Blavatsky, the individual cannot separate himself from the race, nor the race from the individual. This race is different from the other in the modern conception of race. The law of karma applies equally to all, although all are not equally developed in helping on the development of the other. The Theosophist believe that he is not only helping them to fulfill their karma, but that he is also in the strictest sense fulfilling his own in his development of humanity, of which both he and they are integral part. I think there is little time, so I'm leaving something and talking about the self-sacrifice and charity. Blavatsky conception of self-sacrifice is more than the justice to all and love. It is giving the others more than the oneself. It is for the practical good to save money, or several people theosophy holds as for higher than self-abnegation for the sectarian idea. Blavatsky regards self-sacrifice as a duty and explains it by showing that altruism is an integral part of the self-development, and it is teachable by the enlightened application of our percepts to practice, and by the use of our higher reason, spiritual intuition, and moral senses, and by following the dictates of what we call the still small voice of our consciousness. According to Blavatsky, theosophy teaches self-abnegation, but does not teach rash and useless self-sacrifice, nor does it justify fanaticism. So in case of self-sacrifice, Blavatsky, we can say that what is at stake. So for Blavatsky, the self is at stake for the existence of the other. In the same way, regarding charity, the conception of charity for Blavatsky advocates for the responsibility to take that Derrida emphasizes in theoretical works, and for the other, where self put oneself at stake for the body, life of the other, and it is a private affair of the individual who is thinking of the spatial situation, not transcendental. It's being in the body or in the being in the world of the fellow being. For Blavatsky, charity means personal exertion for the other, personal mercy and kindness, personal interest in the welfare of those who suffer, personal sympathy, forethought, and assistance in their troubles and needs. Blavatsky criticized the institutional and interference in approaching to the needy. She advocates for the human touch, fellow feeling. Blavatsky writes, "We believe in revealing the starvation of the soul as much, if not more, than the emptiness of the stomach. For the gratitude does better to the man who feels it, and than to him for whom it is felt." So its paper is finished. So I am arguing that the whole the conception of charity, duty, self-sacrifice of the Blavatsky is immanent, not transcendent. It's thinking in the body. He is thinking about the other, and ethics as a critique of that decision. So thank you.
You are over?
Yeah, ma'am. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, since this discussion will take place after we finish, so now we switch over to the next one, Ajay Jacob. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can see you. So now it's your turn to read your paper. So and your paper is seems to me very interesting. This Sandoz tour of India, 1904 to 5, challenges, triumphs, and enduring legacies.
Yeah.
So Ajay, now you can start. You have 20 to 25 minutes. And after that, we'll go for the next paper and then discussion.
Okay, I'll just do a share screen first. Just a minute. Okay, so I'll just read this out. Since the 1970s, sports history has come a long way globally and evolved as a vibrant area of research. In the South Asian context as well, an overwhelming literature exists on the social history of numerous sports like football, cricket, polo, hunting, wrestling, and martial arts like Kalaripayat. However, very little attention has been given to the history of bodybuilding in India. This paper traces the tour of India by Eugene Sandow, who was at the forefront of the global physical fitness craze of the late 19th and early 20th century, and whose visit acted as a catalyst to the nascent bodybuilding culture in India. Known as the father of bodybuilding, Sandow arrived at Bombay on 22nd October 1904 and left for Penang on 8th June 1905. During his 8 months of stay, Sandow and his vaudeville troupe went to various Indian cities staging performances and giving lectures on physical culture. Using the larger backdrop of the high noon of imperialism, this paper surveys the key interactions of Sandow with the Indians and the legacy he left behind. In doing this, I draw on Mrinalini Sinha's framework of the imperial social formation to foreground particular historical situations and specificities of historical conjunctures within a globally articulated imperial structure. I argue that a plethora of global and regional factors, along with Sandow's business acuity, converged to make his tour of India a triumphal success. My paper also reflects on the salutary lessons contemporary India can absorb from Sandow in the COVID pandemic hit world. In May 1904, Eugene Sandow, a German-born London-based strongman, departed on his world tour of South Africa, India, and the Orient with a group of vaudeville performers. The motivation, as he himself stated, was to preach the gospel of physical culture. His first stop was in Southern Africa, then Aden in the Arabian Peninsula, and on 22nd October, he arrived in Bombay. That same day, a representative of the Advocate of India was given the privilege of an interview with Sandow. Sandow explained to the reporter that his mission in India was not to show his feats of strength, rather to spread the message of physical culture. Sandow also informed the representative that in India, he had great hopes of getting better results than anywhere else. He already had 25,000 to 30,000 pupils in India, whom he instructed by post, and the results he had obtained from them had proved to be better than any other nationality. As will be seen, this was the key to Sandow's marketing strategy. He always emphasized that anybody could improve their physique using his system. Sandow's stay in Bombay was brief, and it was Calcutta that was destined to see an extended performance of the strongman. Even before his arrival in Calcutta, Sandow's appliances began to be daily advertised in the city's newspapers. On the 29th night, Sandow gave his first performance at the Theatre Royal. The Indian Daily News described it as one which was absolutely unparalleled in the records of Calcutta. His show had two parts. The first was occupied by Sandow's vaudeville troupe, and the second was his muscle display, in which Sandow, clad in a scanty leopard skin, posed on a revolving pedestal, reminding audiences of the statues of ancient Greece. Now, for instance, the slide shows Sandow posing as the dying Gaul, which is an ancient Hellenistic statue. This was followed by an exhibition of his strongman feats. Over the next few weeks, the newspapers were abuzz with a new sensation, Eugene Sandow. Newspapers like the Madras Mail and the Tribune described in great detail the physical measurements of the strongman. A special matinee show for children was also held. The Indian Daily News even reported about a lecture delivered for members of the medical profession. On November 11th, along with the previous advertisements, a second advertisement with a challenge thrown open to the public of Calcutta was published, in which Sandow promised a reward of rupees 15,000 to anybody who could accomplish his feats in weightlifting. While in Calcutta, Sandow also kept contributing articles to the Indian Sporting Times. An astute businessman, Sandow knew that the best way to gather support for his system was to use the print media effectively. One of his first articles was on the Indian climate and athletes. In this article, Sandow completely turned around the received colonial wisdom on the tropical climate of India. He pointed out that India had natural advantages for perfect conditioning. Sandow felt that the natives had a fine foundation for the building of a large physique. It was only the lack of proper food and systematic exercises that kept them thin and haggard. In another article titled The Cult of the Athlete, Sando advised the public in India to perfect their breathing first. He informed his readers that ever since he had arrived in India, he himself devoted 4 minutes to breathing exercises each morning. A popular myth regarding physical culture that Sando tried to dispel was a concept called muscle binding. In the 19th century, it was commonly believed that lifting weights heavier than 5 or 10 pounds would eventually lead the athlete to a condition called muscle binding, in which the unfortunate victim became so muscular that he could not move his limbs. Sando contributed a detailed article titled Muscle Bound, clarifying that in order to guard against this condition, it was essential that every muscle in the body ought to be equally exercised. Sando was careful to point out that this was not possible by merely engaging in athletic sports or games, rather by adopting a more scientific system of physical culture, such as the one he was preaching. What becomes evident is that Sando positioned himself as a messiah of good health. By masterfully playing upon the fears of the age, he appealed not just as a strong man, but even spoke the language of a medical professional, as well as a religious preacher who was evangelizing for the body. Now, this slide, I have shown the principal towns and the cities that he stopped at and he was performing. Sando and his troupe left Calcutta on 20th November and proceeded to Allahabad, Lucknow, Kanpur, and Bombay. It was around this time that one of the first challenges to Sando for a wrestling match was issued by a native wrestler from Lahore by the name of Gamun Baliwala. It is not clear whether Sando replied to this challenge, but Gamun Baliwala received a reply from a fellow Indian who pointed out that weight training and bodybuilding as advocated by Sando and Indian wrestling as practiced by native wrestlers were two different things. Bombay saw Sando's longest continuous stay in any Indian city, where he had more than 4,000 consultations with natives. Here, he also had an opportunity to interact with the Parsi community. He contributed an article to the first issue of the Parsi, warning the Parsis of their physical deterioration. In particular, he encountered a rich Parsi businessman called Sir Dhanjibhai Bommanji, who wanted Sando to cure him of elephantiasis. Sando treated him for 6 months, and the patient was so pleased with the result that he paid Mr. Sando 10,000 pounds. Sir Dhanjibhai Bommanji went on to build a large palatial building with 19 acres of land at the head of the harbour near Bombay in honor of the strong man and called it Sando Castle. He also bought Sando a London house, which was named Bommanji Hall. On May 18, the Madras Mail announced that Sando would do his first performance in Madras on May 27th. On the same day, the first challenge to Sando was issued in the letters to the editor column by a Bangalore-based wrestler named Mehbul Khan to a wrestling match in Greco-Roman or catch-as-catch-can style. On May 22nd, another challenge to a wrestling match in Indian Delhi style was issued in the same column by Pehlwan Mohammad Hussain, who worked as a grip instructor at Mysore Police Training School in Bangalore. The very next day, a third challenge was issued by Mohiuddin Pehlwan of Madras, and a fourth challenge to a boxing match was issued by C. Ratnavalu Ochari of Madras. On May 27, Sando gave his first show in Madras. Through the Madras Mail, Sando even issued a sporting offer to all of his challengers to make a present of ₹100 to anyone who can stand up for 20 minutes against any of his pupils, whom Sando would nominate according to the physique of the individual coming forward. Several Indian wrestlers like Mehbul Khan and Karim Baksh accepted the challenge, but not all their bouts were successful against Sando's pupils. Of particular note was the victory of Sando's Indian pupil over Karim Baksh and his juniors. It was here that the audience found a clear example of the advantages that could be obtained when the indigenous system of Indian wrestling was combined with the Occidental system as preached by Sando. Sando left Madras for Penang on 8th June 1905. According to his biographer David Chapman, Sando had faced the largest congregation ever in India. Even people from outside the principal townships that Sando performed in kept writing in the letters to the editor column to catch the strongman's attention, inviting him to visit their towns and villages. One person even referred to him as the 20th century Bhima. A person by the name of Ram Bhadra argued that Sando's remarkable strength was ample evidence that Bhima indeed might have been a real character and not just mythological. He went on to call Sando the Kaliyuga Bhima. So how did Sando's tour give a boost to the nascent bodybuilding culture in India, and what was the legacy he left behind? First, Sando's visit to India had triggered debates about the usefulness and benefits of Sando's brand of physical culture. For instance, immediately a month after Sando left India, the July issue of the Central Hindu College magazine, a journal for Hindu boys, edited by Annie Besant, carried an article by S. Rama Rao advocating a middle path between the Occidental and indigenous systems of physical culture. This combination of indigenous and Occidental methods is evident in the physical culture schemes advocated by people like Professor Ramamurthy, Piyush Kanti Ghosh, Dr. Jayachand Sharma, and in the monthly issue of Vyayam published from Baroda between 1915 and 1954. Professor Ramamurthy even styled himself as the Indian Hercules. Performing strongman acts like Sando, Ramamurthy was also called the Indian Sando. Sando's tour also seems to have influenced wrestlers like Gobar Guha. Nationalist leader Motilal Nehru in his letters advised his teenage son Jawaharlal Nehru to exercise with Sando dumbbells and developer. Mahatma Gandhi too commented favorably from time to time on Sando's system. Wrestler turned Tamil film superstar P.K. Nagalingam, known for his fine physique, was popular as Raja Sando. References to Sando can also be found in Bengali writer Sukumar Ray's farce Lakshmaner Shaktishel, written around 1908, where the demon king Ravana boasts, "I am a Pehelwan equal to Sando." The poem Narada Narada in Ray's Abul Tabul collection of nonsense rhymes for children, published in 1923, features a fight between two Bengali men in which one of them says, "Do you know that I do Sando?" Moreover, an indirect reference to the tour can be found in Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, The Stoner Case. In Act 2, Scene 2, Dr. Rylott, claiming to be the strongest man in India once, bends a poker and throws it at Holmes's feet. Holmes responds by calling it a Sando performance. What becomes discernible is that Sando's arrival in India was perfectly timed. At a global level, it coincided with an era of high globalization and imperialism, with rapid technological and medical advancements, and when narratives of degeneracy, national efficiency, eugenics, social Darwinism, beauty, health, and fitness were in vogue. At a regional level, it coincided with the nationalist movement in India, when ideas about Swadeshi, revolutionary nationalism, health, and manhood began to play a key role in building and sustaining a nationalist identity. Indians had struggled for long to escape the shadow cast by colonial stereotypes of the Indians as degenerate and effeminate, vis-a-vis a strong, active, and virile Englishman. Sando's system of bodybuilding found an eager audience within this milieu. His methods could be used both as a symbolic rebuttal of colonial degeneracy narratives and also as a tool for violent, forcible resistance. The body thus became a site for contestations of power and competing ideologies. And as Nicholas Sturz notes, the technology of bodybuilding was imagined as a means for reconfiguring masculinity through scientific methods. Chapman argues that Western bodybuilding, Chapman argues that Western bodybuilding did not really take off in India until the 1930s. It was then that gymnasiums and athletes began to proliferate at a rapid rate. Bodybuilding books such as Swami Shivanand Tirth's Muscle Building in 6 Months and manuals began to be published in several parts of India. Photo anthologies with classic nude poses of bodybuilders and physical culture enthusiasts imitating the Western magazines began to be published. This is also the period of the Mysore Asana revival in yoga. Professor K.V. Iyer, who had started India's first correspondence course in bodybuilding, attempted to blend yoga, Hindu mysticism, and Occidental physical culture into something uniquely in his own. It was, as Mark Singleton has noted, a period of intense and eclectic experimentation within nationalist physical culture, with manifold techniques and systems being borrowed, adapted, and naturalized to suit Indian needs. To conclude, Sando's tour was a complex mix of dialogue, rejection, and appropriation. If one were to take into account the events during his tour and the legacies after that, indeed his Indian tour was overall a triumphal success. As Chapman notes, Sando's defenders seemed to far outnumber his detractors. He was truly an undisputed monarch of muscles. Lastly, to add something about COVID, in a world that is still reeling from the COVID pandemic since 2019, Sando's system also has several salutary lessons for contemporary India. For instance, Sando embodied the modern man with a modern way of looking at physical culture and health, and who changed the very concept of bodily beauty and fitness. His shows and marketing methods too were thoroughly modern, and he symbolized in several ways the scientific temper of the modern age. In fact, in 1911, King George V granted Sando a royal grant as Professor of Scientific Physical Culture. Jawaharlal Nehru in The Discovery of India has pointed out that the scientific approach and temper are or should be a way of life a process of thinking, a method of acting and associating with our fellow men. As Bhikkhu Parekh points out, Nehru's view of scientific thinking involved checking and relying on facts alone, taking nothing on blind trust or faith, changing beliefs in the light of new evidence, being precise and exact, relying on the method of trial and error, ceaselessly searching for truth, keeping an open mind, and in general, developing the hard discipline of the mind characteristic of the modern age. Nehru applied this to both beliefs and social practices. This spirit of scientificity is even enshrined in our constitution in Article 51A on fundamental duties, which states that it shall be the duty of every citizen of India to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. In today's India, where we are told that cows exhale oxygen, cow urine can treat cancer, peahens become pregnant by drinking the tears of the peacock, or to deal with the pandemic, we need to be thalis and light torches and diyas so that the sound and heat energy will destroy coronavirus. It's time to take stock of how far our Indian society is falling prey to scientific obscurantism and moving away from the path of scientific temper and progress as epitomized by people like Sando and Nehru. Thank you. Thank you. My paper is over.
Thank you. Paper is over now, Ajay Thomas. It was very interesting paper. Can we go back to Asha Rani Jaya, if you are there?
Yes, ma'am.
Asha is here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm here and Asha is also here.
Good.
Fine.
Ma'am, आवाज आ रही है अच्छे से?
आ रही है आशा, आ रही है।
आशा, प्राचीन भारतीय ग्रंथों में बाल्यावस्था से संबंधित अनुष्ठान एवं संस्कार, ये आपका पेपर है जो आज आपको पढ़ना है. Be courageous enough to read this paper.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. मेरा टॉपिक जैसे मैम ने बताया, प्राचीन भारतीय ग्रंथों में बाल्यावस्था से संबंधित अनुष्ठान एवं संस्कार है, जिसका टाइम पीरियड 500 ईसा पूर्व से लेके 200 ईस्वी तक है. अगर हम पारंपरिक बाल्यावस्था की बात करें सबसे पहले, तो हम देखते हैं कि जो प्राचीन भारतीय ग्रंथ है और जो मध्यकालीन ग्रंथ है, उसमें हमें प्रारंभिक बाल्यावस्था और शिशुत्व की जो अवधारणा है वो कम देखने को मिलती है. और साथ ही जो संस्कृत ग्रंथों में हमें शब्द मिलते हैं बाल्यावस्था से लेके, जैसे कि समाजशास्त्री शब्द भ्रूण या गर्भ जो शब्द मिलते हैं, साथ ही प्रेम और स्नेह के लिए जो शब्द मिलते हैं, इनकी भी जो हमें ये शब्द मिलते हैं, इनकी परिभाषाएं नहीं दी गई हैं. इस संबंध में हमें वैनिसा आर सेंसन का व्यू इम्पोर्टेंट है. वे अपनी बुद्धिस्ट जो वर्क है उसमें भी ये समस्या देखती है कि ये इन शब्दों में क्या, इस सिस्टम में क्या प्रॉब्लम्स हैं. तो वो बताती है कि हमें जो बाल्यावस्था की अवधारणा है ना, उनको शब्दों में निश्चित परिभाषाएं नहीं देनी चाहिए, ना ही उन्हें शब्दों के मापदंडों से परिभाषित करना चाहिए. क्योंकि कई बार कुछ वर्ष का शिशु भी बच्चा हो सकता था और कम अधिकारों वाला अधिकार प्राप्त व्यक्ति भी शिशु हो सकता था. ऐसा इसलिए हो रहा था क्योंकि शिशु की जो अवधारणा थी उसको जैविक विकास से नहीं जोड़ा गया था. मैं अपने पेपर में बाल्यावस्था से जुड़ी जो संस्कारों और अनुष्ठानों में जो समाजीकरण हो रहा है उनके आधार पर अनुष्ठानिक बाल्यावस्था की बात करूंगी. तो हम सबसे पहले बात करें तो जो जीवन चक्र अनुष्ठानों का महत्व क्या था बालक के जीवन में. हम देखते हैं कि बालक और बाल्यावस्था से जुड़े हुए अनुष्ठानों की शुरुआत माता के गर्भ में हो जाती है और ये उपनयन तक जाते हैं. और इन अनुष्ठानों द्वारा, जैसे कि नृत्य विज्ञानी आर्नल्ड वेन कहते हैं कि अपने इम्पोर्टेंट वर्क लेट्स राइट द पैसेज में बताते हैं कि जो इन अनुष्ठानों से, जैसे कि इन अनुष्ठानों की सहायता से जो समाज में पुनरुत्पत्ति होती है शिशु की, वो समाज का अंग बनता है और इस प्रोसेस में उसके जो शारीरिक मानसिक विकास है उसको सहायता दी जाती है और अल्टीमेटली उसको समाज का अंग बनाया जाता है. अगर हम भारतीय संदर्भ में बात करें तो यहाँ पे हमें जो जीवन चक्र अनुष्ठान जिसका शब्द का उपयोग आर्नल्ड वेन करते हैं उसको संस्कार कहते हैं. अगर हम बात करें तो राजवली पांडे के अनुसार जो संस्कार है वो हमें सार्वभौमिक तौर पे दिखाई देते हैं और ये हमें प्राचीन संस्कृतियों में भी दिखाई देते हैं और आधुनिक धर्म सीमा है उसमें भी दिखाई देते हैं. और मैं यहाँ पे हिरण्यकेशी गृहसूत्र, धर्मसूत्र, रामायण और मनुस्मृति के आधार पे प्रारंभिक बाल्यावस्था से जुड़े अनुष्ठान और जो उनके चेंजेस आते हैं उनकी बात करूंगी। इस संबंध में जैसे कि जया त्यागी भी बताती हैं कि जो ग्रंथ है या उनको लिखा जा रहा है, उससे हमें जो रचना की जा रही है उससे उनकी कल्पना के बारे में पता चलता है। ये जो ग्रंथ है इनको किस शैली में लिखा जा रहा है, कैसे लिखा जा रहा है, और इसकी जो विषय वस्तु है ना, हमें महत्वपूर्ण जानकारी प्रदान करती है और यहाँ की सोसाइटी की परिदृश्य के बारे में बताती है। सबसे पहले मैं गृहसूत्र के बाल्यावस्था की बात करूंगी, जो अनुष्ठान होते हैं। सबसे पहले गृहसूत्र की बात करें तो इसके टाइम पीरियड को 800 ईसा पूर्व से लेके 500 ईसा पूर्व के मध्य या उसके बाद भी स्थापित किया जाता है, ठीक है। और जो प्रारंभिक गृहसूत्र है उसमें विशेषकर जैसे कि अश्वल्या, बौधायन, गोबिला सम्मिलित है, और जो उत्तर वैदिक जो गृहसूत्र है उसमें हिरण्यकेशी, जैमिनीय, वेखन्य आदि महत्वपूर्ण गृहसूत्र है। मैं जो बात करने वाली हूँ विशेषकर हिरण्यकेशी गृहसूत्र की बात करने वाली हूँ। हिरण्यकेशी से स्टार्ट करें तो इसमें हमें अनुष्ठान, रीति रिवाज, बलिदानों के बारे में बताया गया है, जिसका पालन गृहस्थ को रोजमर्रा के जीवन में करना है। यहाँ पर हम गृहसूत्रों में देखते हैं कि हमें 12 से या 18 जीवन जो पवित्र संस्कार है उनकी संख्या मिलती है। और यहाँ पे जो संस्कार शब्द का प्रयोग नहीं किया गया है, यहाँ पे इसको घरेलू अनुष्ठानों के अर्थ में लिया गया है। और इसमें जो मानव शुद्धि के जो अर्थ है, अवधारणा है, वो अभी नहीं आई थी, ठीक है। और जो जन्म हिरण्यकेशी में हम जन्म पूर्व अनुष्ठानों से शुरुआत करते हैं, तो हम देखते हैं कि जो जन्म पूर्व अनुष्ठान है उसमें विशेषकर पुत्र प्राप्ति की इच्छा दिखाई देती है, प्रबल दिखाई देती है। इसीलिए जो शादी से पहले अनुष्ठान होते थे नववधु पे, उसमें हमें दिखाई देता है कि बोला जाता था, जैसे कि अग्नि से प्रार्थना की गई थी कि पत्नी की संतान को मृत्यु के बंधन से मुक्त करो। राजा वरुण से अनुदान मांगा जाता था कि इसको मृत्यु के बंधन से इसको सुरक्षा प्रदान की जाए, और अग्नि से बोला जाता था कि इसे बुढ़ापे तक ले जाए। इस तरह हम देख सकते हैं कि जो शिशु की मृत्यु को लेके जो डर है ना वो असल था, और इसे नर वधु की घर में एंट्री के साथ ही इसको अनुष्ठानों द्वारा इसकी जनन क्षमता और शिशु धारण को मजबूत करने का प्रयास किया जा रहा था। हिरण्यकेशी बताता है कि प्रत्येक ऋतुस्राव के बाद संभोग किया जा सकता था, ठीक है। और जो पाणी ग्रहण है ना, हमें वहां देखने को मिलता है कि यहाँ पे अधिक से अधिक संख्या में संतान की उत्पत्ति की मांग की जा रही थी। इंद्र से इतना भी कहा जाता था कि 10 से ज्यादा 10 कम से कम 10 पुत्रों प्रदान किए जाए। इससे रिलेटेड हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे जो संतान थी ना वो परिवार की आर्थिक और राजनीतिक आवश्यकताओं को भी पूरी करती थी, साथ ही हमें समुदाय के एक अंग के रूप में भी कार्य करवाती थी। इसीलिए ऐसी संतान को लाने के लिए विशेषकर देवताओं की सहायता ली जाती थी। हम गर्भ धारण में भी देखते हैं कि जैसे कि प्रार्थनाएं की जाती थी कि विष्णु से प्रार्थना की जाती थी कि इसे गर्भधारण दिलाया जाए। शिशु को त्वेषा को आराधना की जाती थी कि इसके गर्भ को आकार दिया जाए। प्रजापति इसमें बीज स्थापित करे, इसमें ये बताया गया था। और साथ ही शिशु की रक्षा और स्वास्थ्य को ध्यान रखते हुए अग्नि, इंद्र और वायु का आह्वान किया गया था। और जो चौथे महीने हम सामंत्योनयन संस्कार देखते हैं, यहाँ देखते हैं कि जैसे यहाँ पे भी हम देखते हैं कि देवताओं का आह्वान किया जाता है। पांडुरंग, वामन, काणे भी बताते हैं कि जो सीमंतोनयन संस्कार है उसमें जो शुभ प्रतीक थे उनका प्रयोग किया जाता था, जैसे कि 3 छंद, देवताओं के शुभ प्रतीकों का यूज किया जाता है, जैसे 3 छंद, 3 स्वाद, 3 लोग। और अब हम बात करते हैं कि जीवन पूर्व में अनुष्ठान कौन कौन से हो रहे थे। सब प्रथम तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे भ्रूण की सुरक्षा, यहाँ पे मेन फोकस था कि भ्रूण को सुरक्षित रखना है गर्भ में और निर्विघ्न उसका जन्म हो सके, ये ध्यान दिया जाता था। इसके लिए देखा जाता है कि बोला जाता था कि और यहाँ पे सिर्फ पुरुष संतान को स्थापित करने के लिए बोला जाता था कि गर्भ को खोलो, बीज को अंदर लो। पुरुष संतान भ्रूण गर्भ करे, माता 10 महीने बाद इसे धारण करे और पुत्र का ही जन्म हो और वह अपने नातेदारों में सबसे साहसी हो। और आगे फिर पुंसवन में इसको पूरा ही पुंसतान को पूरा ही स्थापित कर दिया जाता है, जहां पर हम ऐसी औषधियों का यूज किया जाता था जिससे कि औषधियों का जैसे कि जैसे कि पत्नी को दही के साथ जौ के दाने, राई या 2 फलियां खिलाई जाती थी। उसके नथनों में न्योगृदा के तने और घी के साथ मिला के नथनों में डाला जाता था। जहाँ पे हम देखते हैं कि जो जौ के दाने, जहाँ उसको दही के साथ चीजें खिलाई जा रही हैं, वो पुत्र से संबंधित थी प्रतीकात्मक तौर पे, और इन संबंधों में चिकित्सक गुण भी थे। अब हम जन्म अनुष्ठानों की बात करें तो यहाँ हम देखते हैं कि इनका जोर ज्यादा, हम देखते हैं कि शिशु को सुरक्षित करना है, बुरी शक्तियों से भी बचाना है और इसके शारीरिक विकास को आगे बढ़ाना है। तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे जो अनुष्ठान हो रहे हैं, वहां पे पिता की इम्पोर्टेंस बढ़ती दिखाई देती है। जैसे कि जात कर्म अनुष्ठानों में हम देखते हैं, ज्यादातर अनुष्ठानों को तो पिता महत्वपूर्ण था। वह ही सबसे पहले बच्चे को छूता था, स्पष्ट करता था, बोलता था कि पर्वत बनो, कुठार बनो, अजय बनो। फिर उसके जो बौद्धिक विकास था उसके लिए मेदजना का प्रदर्शन करता था। आगे फिर इसके बाद हम देखते हैं कि नामकरण का संस्कार किया जाता था, जिसमें कि उसके प्रथम नाम को गुप्त रखा जाता था और जो उसका द्वितीय नाम है वो दिया जाता था। इस संबंध में जया त्यागी हमें बताती हैं कि इन अनुष्ठानों के द्वारा पता चलता है कि शिशु शुरुआती समय में बहुत संवेदनशील था और वो प्रतिस्पर्धी सामाजिक परिस्थितियां थी जहाँ पे शिशु पर कर्मकांडी कृत्य किए जाते होंगे। और ऐसा ही हम देखते हैं कि ऐसा ही व्यवहार हम मुंडन में भी किया जाता था, जहाँ पे नव उत्पन्न के बालों को तबेले या उदम्बरा के पेड़ या दरबा घास के पास रखा जाता था, जहाँ पर पूषण और बृहस्पति का निवास होता था। उसके बाद अन्नप्राशन अनुष्ठान किया जाता था, जिसमें कि उसके शारीरिक विकास पर ध्यान दिया जाता था। बाद में मुंडन अनुष्ठान किया जाता था, जिसमें कि जैसे कि विशेष तौर पे ज्ञानी सावित्री के उस्तरे को आह्वान किया जाता था, जिससे कि शिशु के कोई हानि ना पहुंचे, और जो उसकी जो शिखा थी उस शिखा के बालों को बचाए रखा जिसके संबंध में पांडे बताती हैं कि ऐसा इसलिए किया जाता था क्योंकि सिर के पास अधुपति नामक अंग होता था, जिन पे अगर छोटी सी भी क्षति होती है तो इसके आकस्मिक मृत्यु हो सकती है। अंत हम देखते हैं कि इन अनुष्ठानों द्वारा, जैसे कि टैलकन पासमन भी कहती है कि यहाँ पे वो बात जैसे करती है कि सामाजिक संबंधों और संस्थाओं में शिशु का वयस्क निर्माण कैसे किया जाता है। तो बताती है कि शिशु जन्म के साथ तालाब रूपी समाज में उसको फेंका जाता था। तो जैसे जैसे वो बड़ा होता था उसकी समाज में स्थिति बदल जाती थी और उसे कुछ शर्तों को पूरा करना होता था, फिर ही वह विस्तृत समूह का अंग बन सकता था। ऐसा हम अनुष्ठानों में देख सकते हैं, जहाँ पे उसको प्रारंभिक स्तर में ही अनुष्ठानों से परिचित करवाया जा रहा था और अनुष्ठान से परिचित करवा के उसको समाजीकरण को सुगम बनाया जा रहा था। अंत हम अगले ग्रंथ की बात करें, हम धर्मसूत्रों की बात करें तो धर्मसूत्रों में निरूपित बाल्यावस्था से जुड़े नियम और कानून। जब हम धर्मसूत्रों में आते हैं तो हम देखते हैं कि धर्मसूत्र गृह सूत्र जो है धर्मसूत्रों की निरंतरता में लिखे गए थे। इसका टाइम पीरियड 300 ईसा पूर्व से 200 ईस्वी तक है, जहाँ पे घरेलू अनुष्ठानों का जिक्र नहीं किया गया है। यहाँ पे अधिकार, कर्तव्य, विधि, नियमों के बारे में बताया गया है। इसीलिए यहाँ पे जीवन चक्र जो अनुष्ठान है, पवित्र अनुष्ठान है, उनके बारे में ज्यादा जानकारी प्रदान नहीं की गई है। इस संबंध में हमें एक अपवाद मिलता है, गौतम धर्मसूत्र, जो हमें 40 जीवन पवित्र अनुष्ठानों का उल्लेख करता है। ठीक है। और अगर हम बात करें तो यहाँ पे धर्मसूत्र में नियम और कानून दिए गए हैं। तो यहाँ बताया गया है कि जो गृहस्थ था वो इम्पोर्टेंट था क्योंकि वो संतान उत्पत्ति करता था, और नियम बताए गए थे। जैसे आपस स्तंभ धर्मसूत्र में बताया गया था कि रात को संभोग नहीं करना चाहिए, दिन के दौरान संभोग नहीं करना चाहिए, रात निर्धारित करी गई थी। इसी प्रकार बताया गया था कि अगर पत्नी संतान प्राप्ति नहीं कर पाती तो हम दूसरी पत्नी ला सकते हैं, और गर्भवती महिलाओं के लिए संरक्षण के लिए नियम बनाए गए थे। और जो भ्रूण हत्या थी ना, उस पर विशेष चिंता का विषय था। जो वशिष्ठ धर्मसूत्र है हमें बताता है कि जो भ्रूण की हत्या ना, वो ब्राह्मण की हत्या के समान है। इसीलिए जो महिला जो मानसिक धर्म में होती थी, ब्राह्मण महिला, उसकी हत्या को भी पाप माना जाता था। इनमें कड़ी सजाएं लगाई जाती थी, जैसे कि ऐसी सजाएं लगाई जाती थी जिसमें जो पापी था, भ्रूण हत्यारा, वो देवताओं का आह्वान करता था कि मुझे मृत्यु दो। ठीक है, और हम देखते हैं कि जो गौतम ने हमें 40 अनुष्ठानों की जानकारी दी गई है, उसमें विशेषकर हम देखते हैं कि उपनयन, 4 वेद व्रत, स्नान, विवाह, 5 दैनिक महायज्ञ आदि का उल्लेख किया गया है। इन जो ये अनुष्ठान है, इसके बारे में हमें ना आपस्तंभ धर्मसूत्र बताता है, ना बौधायन, ना वशिष्ठ बताता है। इस संबंध में इतिहासकारों के भिन्न-भिन्न विचार है। जैसे कि सुरेश चंद्र बैनर्जी बताते हैं कि ऐसा क्यों हुआ? वो बताते हैं कि इस अनुपस्थिति का कारण ये था कि जो इस टाइम पे जो अनुष्ठान थे ना, उनका प्रचलन से बाहर हो गए थे और उनका महत्व कम हो गया था। इसी कारण से जो बाद का धर्मसूत्र है, विष्णु धर्मसूत्र, हमें वहां पे उपनयन और विवाह के बाद विशेष अनुष्ठानों का उल्लेख किया गया था।
आशा
लेकिन जो
समराइज
तो मैम मैं निष्कर्ष पढ़ देती हूँ।
निष्कर्ष।
ओके,
2 मिनट।
ओके मैम। तो इस प्रकार हम देखते हैं कि जो संस्कार है, वो समय कालों में विकसित हुए थे, संस्कारों की अवधारणा। और जो हम शुरुआत में गृह सूत्र से स्टार्ट करते हैं, तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ जो संस्कार थे, वो संस्कारों के अर्थ में आते थे, लेकिन उसको सही उचित शब्द के रूप में यूज नहीं किया गया था। यहाँ पे लोकप्रिय और अंधविश्वासी तत्व शामिल थे, इसीलिए यहाँ पे बीमारियों को दूर करने के लिए, बच्चे को बचाने के लिए अनुष्ठान किए जाते। लेकिन जब हम धर्मसूत्र के टाइम पे आते हैं, तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे अनुष्ठानों में नैतिक विशेषता के नियम लागू हो गए थे। इसीलिए कहा गया था कि इसीलिए गौतम बताता है कि जो अनुष्ठान है, उसमें जो 40 अनुष्ठान करना इतना इम्पोर्टेंट नहीं था, जितना इम्पोर्टेंट आत्मा के नियमों को पालन करना था। साथ ही हम रामायण पे जब आते हैं, तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे जो अनुष्ठान है, वो भिन्न प्रकार से प्रदर्शित किए गए थे और यहाँ पे कई धार्मिक समारोही तत्वों को शामिल किया गया था। लेकिन यहाँ पे हम देखते हैं कि जो संस्कार है, उसमें संस्कार और बलिदानों में भिन्नता नहीं की गई है और इसमें सामाजिक संदर्भ दिखाया गया था। लेकिन जब हम मनु के टाइम पे आते हैं, तो हम देखते हैं कि यहाँ पे अनुष्ठानों को सामाजिक आचरण से अधिक संबंधित किया गया था। उनके द्वारा पंच महायज्ञों को दिखाया गया था, उन पे विस्तार पे बताया गया था। और साथ ही जो अंतरजातीय विवाह की को नहीं माना गया था। और स्मृतियों द्वारा जो अनुष्ठानिक धर्म है और जो दैवीय अनुष्ठान है, उनको कम कर दिया गया था। और इसमें इन अनुष्ठानों में उन्होंने जोड़ा था कि वह उसमें उच्च धार्मिक और शुद्ध जीवन के तत्वों को जोड़ते हैं। इसीलिए वो बताता है कि जो इन अनुष्ठानों के पाले से विवेक से संबंधित और गर्भाज्य से संबंधित अशुद्धियां साफ हो जाएंगी, या इसके बाद अन्य जीवन भी शुद्ध हो जाएगा। थैंक यू मैम। मैम
मैम आई थिंक
ठीक है, अभी we'll just wait for Professor Vijay Lakshmi to join in.
Sorry, I thought I have joined. So all these papers were very interesting. These 4 papers. और कुछ सवाल हैं chat box में, उनको भी लेंगे. I would request student to read those questions. Or and first we'll start with Ratna Priya. One question for Ratna Priya chat box also. And now students are looking for question to these scholars. Can someone read the chat box?
yes ma'am. Yes ma'am, just one second.
Thank you. For Ratna Priya.
Ratnapriya, the first question is from Facebook by Shailendra Mohan Jha. He is asking, Narayan Bali and Nag Bali both were performed after the death of a person whose desires were not fulfilled. Do these desires link these rituals with material life of that person and society also?
There is another question. I think I'll answer this first and then we can go to Arushi's question. There are two questions.
Yeah,
from
there are two questions.
Yeah.
Oh. All right. Thank you, sir, for this question. Yes, I think these desires link the ritual with material life of that person in society. What happened in case of Narayan Bali or Nag Bali, in like which was basically performed in cases of unnatural or abnormal deaths. So when a person is dying normally, there was a typical funeral rite that was common for all, where you are dying normally, and where the ghost and where people thought that yes, the ghost is being satiated, and there was no anxiety in people. But in case of unnatural deaths, where people had more anxiety about the satisfaction from the end of the ghost, that is why Narayan Bali was seen more as a extra precautionary measure, just to keep the ghosts at bay, and so that no ill happenings are taking over their family. And according to the text, if we just stick to the text, the anxiety can be only seen in case of different rituals that are being performed. And again, people want that sort of confirmation. The rituals show that sort of confirmation that, we are protected from the ghosts. But on the contrary, what we see, if we look at the ethnographic records, the story is a little different, where the case in cases of unfulfilled wishes, according like apart from the general funerary rites and Narayan Bali, people also perform certain other rituals. The two cases of like marrying, like death of an unmarried person and dying without a son, these two cases are more crucial. So it seems like this is something that you need to do before you die. Like you cannot die unmarried and dying without a son. So we do not find any reference in the text, but ethnographic records definitely give us a different picture, where a person who is dying unmarried, so then there the effigy is burned, and there is also a ritual where you are getting married. Sometimes the effigy is married to a plant or to some other object before cremating the body. This happens mostly in the tribal community. And there is a very good study of the Chetri caste in Nepal. So what they do is, on the 13th day of the proceedings, they perform the Narayan Bali even in case of unnatural deaths, just as a precautionary method, to keep themselves and their family safe from the dangerous acts of the ghosts. So most of the time the Garud Puran, the text, the story which the text portrays, is very different from the ethnographic records. And Arushi,
You want second question?
Yeah, can I go?
Yeah.
Okay. So
That is
I just want to ask one.
Arushi's question.
Okay, Arushi
Yeah.
is talking about.
She just wants to ask that the way you mentioned about the spirit or going to heaven and the varying time period based on caste, how does this connect with the karma and the rebirth theory? And if these unfulfilled desires and rituals were related to that in any way?
Okay, so what we find in the Garud Puran is that, based on the caste hierarchy, the period of pollution for the Brahmanas were supposed to be lesser in the Vedic times, or the Vedic texts. They show that the time for the Brahmanas was less compared to the Shudras. On the contrary, we see an inversion in the Puran, where in case of unnatural deaths, the Brahmins had a longer time of pollution compared to the Shudras. Now, this shows that, in case of now unnatural death is actually related to the sins that a person is committing. So the more the sin, the more the chances of, dying unnaturally. And a Brahman, or the Brahman who is at the top of the Varna hierarchy, he's supposed to uphold the Varna order. And if he's doing something more sinful, that means he has to pay more, that the community as a whole has to pay more. So that is why, in order to uphold the Varna hierarchy, the pollution, the period of pollution was afflicted more on the Brahmanic sector than the Shudras, which was very contrary to the Vedic rituals. So what I would like to say is, the entire idea of, upholding the Varna order becomes very crucial in the Puranic time. And somebody who is not doing that has to suffer greatly in the hell, and also after death, they have to maintain a longer pollution period.
Well, any other question for Ratnapriya?
Ma'am, there is one in the chat box by Kundan Raj. He has asked that wife of Shiva and daughter of Daksha self-immolated. Please comment on this untimely demise.
Okay, I think this question is very specific with the issue of Sati, which apparently I've not dealt in my paper, but the Garur Puran never talks, about a widow. What I would say, they have assumed that a woman whose husband dies first would self-immolate herself on the pyre. So there is no unnatural death in case of a widow.
Is it so, or you are assuming?
No, ma'am, it's there. It's that there is no ritual for untimely death of a widow. If a widow dies untimely, there is no such ritual for that. So it's.
But Garun Puran doesn't talk about Sati, I suppose.
Yes, not precisely.
You are assuming this, no?
Yes, because there's no. I thought maybe there is
okay.
there are instances where they talk. The woman.
You can go through it again. I mean, I'm not very sure, but I think Garun Puran doesn't talk about Sati. Okay. Any other question? Okay, can we go for Ajay Thomas' question in the chat box? Can you read it for me?
Yes, ma'am. Just 1 second. So, Aditi, would you like to ask this question yourself? Should I read it out?
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Abhijit. So, Ajay, thank you so much. It was very interesting paper. I just had a couple of questions that are written in the chat box. So what constituted the concept of a perfect body when Sandoz began his journey? And did it transform after he disseminated his message? And secondly, were his methods and ideas accepted by all communities and religious groups? And if that was so, how was he appropriating and amalgamating different prevailing indigenous traditions, including that of the martial arts? I mean, of course, in a different context, you have given the examples about his portrayal as Bhima or Ravana, etc. But I was just wondering, how is he taking from the martial arts that were already present? We have evidence about Mallapuran, etc. existing in Gujarat. So in that context.
So to answer your first question, what constituted the concept of the perfect body? So what happened was that in the around the 19th century, the early 19th century, a thin body, for instance, was considered the ideal of beauty. But by the late 19th century, when bodybuilding actually began in Europe, so the concept began to change of bodybuilding. So having good biceps, having good abs, being muscular, etc., began to be considered the perfect body. Also in relation to this, there was this whole Greco-Roman ideal of mens sana in corpore sano. This was very popular during the physical culture movement in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It means a healthy mind in a healthy body. So that combined with this whole musculature that was coming into the body, that was considered the bio-ideal of beauty by the late 19th and the early 20th century. And that in certain ways, if you see, it continues even till now. You look at the bodybuilding culture that's going on. Even now, what Sandoz set in motion, like Sandoz was the most popular proponent of bodybuilding. He was not the only one, that I would say, but he was considered the father of bodybuilding because he combined marketing strategies with the studio lighting. Everything was very modern, and so he became the most popular face of bodybuilding in the late 19th century. But whatever he put out, like, if you go to the gymnasium, like, exercising with dumbbells, how many sets you should do, progressive weight training, like you first start with 5 kgs or 2.5 kgs, then you go on to 10 kgs. As you develop, your muscles become bigger. This whole thing was started by Eugene Sandoz, a system. His was that's why he was called a professor of scientific physical culture by King George V in 1911. So that's how the concept of the perfect body began to become more musculature by the late 19th and early 20th century. So, and to answer your question, did it transform after he disseminated his message? What I would say was, in India, it was appropriated largely. I wouldn't say it was totally accepted. It was rejected by indigenous wrestlers. Wrestlers kept challenging him throughout his tour. They wanted to wrestle, but he pointed out that, what I'm doing is bodybuilding and muscle display. I'm not a wrestler. That's what he was saying. And that was actually a kind of a turning point where a lot of people were understanding the difference between bodybuilding and wrestling, which is the indigenous practices of wrestling and bodybuilding. So that was so. And go on to your second point, if so, then how was he appropriate? Like, when Sandow went back to London, he actually wrote in one of his articles that I learned little. My tour of India was very successful, but I learned little from them. But there is a person called Carrie Watt who came out with an article in 2016, and he actually mentions that Sandow actually developed embrocation. Embrocation is basically an ointment, which actually he came to know from the Indian wrestlers. That's what they say. And he started selling it as his own. This was for relieving pain and things like that. So that ointment was actually sold by him, Sandow's embrocation. So that is a kind of something that he was absorbing from the Indian traditions. And this was like, a lot of Pahalwans, if you know that, the older times, now it's becoming less, but they used to set bones, they used to do massages. And this was part of the wrestling training. Like, it was a part of the wrestling culture that we had in India. So he did absorb to some extent the indigenous system. But overall, when he went back, he did say that, I haven't absorbed anything from the Indians. I had very little to learn from them. But this is what, and like, I would say he was successful. Most of the communities did accept what he was doing. And there was this kind of a dialogue in the Central Hindu College magazine. I just picked that up and I saw that they were debating that, we have to follow a middle path. We can't pick it from them. And, we can't because his system might be, is expensive because it has machines and things like that. Our system is cheap. So that's why, that was a whole quote. I mean, I didn't put that quote here. So they actually debated this whole thing. And Professor Ramamurthy, whose photograph I had shown you, he and several others by the late 1920s, 1930s, they were actually advocating a middle path. They were talking about, we are taking this from the old Gurukul system or the Brahmachari, and, they were talking a lot of things in their physical culture scheme. But actually, it was several scholars have argued that that was actually also very modern. In a very modern idiom, they were putting it. Though
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That's all.
It's very interesting, I know, but time is going off. Now there's another question for Ajay. Can you, by Niyati, no? So Niyati, can you ask this?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, thank you. Yes, Ajay, thank you for the very interesting paper. Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to know as to what the colonial state's attitude towards Sandow's tour was. Did they not resist the fact that he was spreading the message of physical fitness and superiority amongst the natives?
Yeah. So just a moment. Yeah. So actually, the colonial state had a very complicated kind of a relationship with the natives, in the sense that, they were advocating English European games and European systems of physical culture like football, cricket, etc. That should be imbibed by the Indians. But at the same time, it was in a way, it should not be in a way that it would challenge the colonial powers. So when Sandow actually came there, whatever I found in the archives was that they were very excited, including the European population. They were very excited. And I don't have any official, the government response. I don't have any such thing to actually speak on that. But the European population was very excited about it. And there was a gymnasium that was opened in Calcutta just after his visit. and that had people who were trained in the Sandoz system. So, and that was for the police. It was a police gymnasium that was opened up. So I would say the colonial state did not resist it as much. They were encouraging it.
That's fine. So no more questions for Ajay, and time is also running short. So is there any question for Asha Rani? No. Hello. Is there any question for Dheeraj Kumar Sahani? That's practical theosophy. No. Anyway, it's all these 4 papers were very interesting, and particularly I found Ajay Thomas's paper very interesting because it is very contemporary also, and we had ancient practices also of yogic practices and malla and other things, which was, you know, physical exercise being done, akhadas and kushtis and yogas. These were the ancient practices and narrated in epics and Puranas and many other texts. And that is also evident as Sandoz is termed as Bhim and Ravan and other ancient heroes. So the paper was very interesting. I'll not go into details of this paper. We can discuss it later. The other paper on this Ratna Priya's paper is also very interesting. Probably I had read her term paper also. It was quite interesting. Overall, Asha Rani seemed to be little not very confident, but she read her paper very confidently, and her paper was also very good. And there are certain, you know, questions regarding Asha Rani's paper, especially one that her paper was mostly in the form of narration. So that could be more critical, and I think she will do it critically also. Dheeraj Kumar's paper on concept of theosophy was also good. So overall, I feel that students are doing very well, and I encourage them and thank also them for reading these papers so confidently in this seminar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, and all the panelists for this wonderful and really interesting session. Now, before we move on with the conference, let's break for lunch for an hour and assemble back here around 2. I'll see you all at 2. Thank you.